Today, I want to help you understand who pays the taxes on a land contract. Whenever I talk about land contracts, it seems like a lot of questions come up, more and more questions, and a common one is who pays the taxes on a land contract? Well, by the end of this video, you're going to have a clear understanding of who is obligated to pay the taxes when it comes to a land contract. Have you ever wondered who holds certain responsibilities in a land contract? Who's responsible for maintenance, repairs? Who's responsible for taxes or insurance? Well, stick around as I cover all of these questions by first helping you understand exactly what a land contract is. Then I'm going to explain some of the important components inside of a land contract. And finally, who holds certain responsibilities in a land contract, specifically who pays the taxes. If you're ready, let's go. So a land contract is a seller financing agreement that is typically used when a buyer cannot get traditional financing to purchase a home. So why would a buyer ever want to utilize a land contract? Well, here's probably one of the biggest reasons. When it comes to land contracts, many times a buyer doesn't need to put a down payment down or have credit history or being credit worthy enough to get traditional financing. Because of that, there is a little bit of a risk on the sellers. They're dealing with an individual that isn't necessarily as credit worthy. And because you're not making them have a down payment, there is risk involved if you're the seller. And if you've ever been in a situation as a buyer where you've had your credit damaged because of a late payment, maybe a short sale, or maybe been through a foreclosure process, the chances of you getting a home down the road are extremely difficult because the banks have really been tightening up. And so if you want to gain home ownership, a land contract is a great way to do that. So within a land contract, there are certain components that make this up that you need to understand. Number one is the purchase price. I think everybody understands that. Buyer and seller actually negotiate because there's no bank involved. They're negotiating back and forth with each other. So you got to figure out the purchase price. You got to figure out what the interest rate is. Now, because the seller's taking a risk, almost always that seller is going to charge a higher interest rate than a bank would because of that additional risk. So your payment's probably going to be a little bit more. The other thing you need to negotiate on is a down payment. Many times there isn't a down payment. Sometimes there might be. You also got to figure out what the monthly payment is associated with the interest rate and the periodic or what frequency or cadence those payments are made. Many times within a land contract, there's something called a balloon payment. A balloon payment is the final payment that is made that pays off the principal balance of the loan. So let's say that you get into a land contract and you're making a certain monthly payment every single month, and that payment is composed of both principal and interest. But after 5 years, the seller requires a balloon payment to be made. Now, you might make all these payments 5 years down the road. You've got to make that balloon payment, and that traditionally is paid off when the buyer goes to a bank and says, listen, I'm now ready to be qualified for a loan. The bank gives that person a loan. The buyer uses that money from the bank to pay off the balance remaining of principal that's owed to the seller. Another important component and element within a land contract is something called equitable title. This prevents the seller from going around the buyer and reselling the property. Also, it makes sure that there's no liens or encumbrances on the property itself. And this is an important thing to note. The seller remains legal title to the property until that final payment in the land contract is made. Now, the buyer can hold equitable title, but legal title always trumps equitable title. Another important thing that I would always mention, especially for the buyer, is making sure that there are a clause in there of what happens if you default on payments. Now, why is this so important? Because a land contract absolutely benefits the seller. And if the buyer were to default on the property, the seller can act as a landlord and evict them from the property and retain all the payments the buyer's made and retain the property. And so as a buyer, it can become very scary. So if you have a clause in there in the contract that talks about what happens if you miss a payment, if you're late on a payment, or default altogether, that can protect you. And I tell everybody, right? Because each state is a little bit different. Get a real estate attorney involved. It's going to be so worth it to have their knowledge and their insight, especially for state-specific land contracts. So what are the benefits to the seller in a land contract? Well, they can charge a little bit more, right? Because they're taking a greater risk. They can pull potential buyers out of the woodwork that have been sitting on the sideline because they're allowing buyers to get in without a down payment or without the credit history to be able to get a traditional financed loan. It also takes a whole lot less time to go through a land contract than it does traditional mortgage. But the biggest benefit and advantage to a seller in a land contract is their ability to act as a landlord without any of the landlord responsibilities. And this is where it comes to answer your question, because in a land contract, the seller is not responsible for the maintenance, the repairs, the insurance, or the taxes. Now that can be negotiated one way or another, but traditionally with a land contract, the buyer is responsible for the taxes that are paid. Now, obviously the seller needs to make sure that the buyer is paying those taxes. Well, many times the seller will require that the buyer gives them a notice to make sure that those taxes are paid. But land contracts can be an absolutely amazing tool for you as a real estate investor, as a seller financing tool, especially if you're engaged in a real estate strategy called slow flips. That's almost always used. But there's a lot of different strategies out there. Matter of fact, I have been scouring the real estate world for the last year, figuring out which strategy is working in today's market. And I've come up with a strategy that I think works in any market that's producing a lot of cash flow and amassing a lot of wealth. And it's something that I've come up with, and I've coined the term cash flow flipping. Now, I've written a book called Cash Flow Flipping, and I'm giving it away to you 100% free just for stopping by and watching the video. Just click on the link below, cashflowflipping.com. Thanks for stopping by. Have an amazing day.